Her baby was taken as debt payment until a mountain man rode into town at noon. Colorado Territory, noon. Saturday market, 1879. The sun scorched the dust-packed ground of Whitlock's main square, where wooden stalls groaned under the weight of potatoes, dry meat, and broken promises. But no one was buying produce today. Not when the courthouse steps had been turned into an auction block. Frances Ashby stood at the foot of those steps, her arms empty, her breath short. Her bonnet hung loose over her pale face, and her blue calico dress, faded and thin, clung to her from the dry heat. She looked like she was made of paper, folded too many times, about to tear. Her infant daughter lay in a cradle 10 feet away. "This here asset is being seized under Article 3B of the Whitlock Credit Reclamation Act," barked the town bailiff, reading from a yellowed document. "Due to the unpaid debt of Mr. Gerald Ashby, deceased, the remaining collateral includes household property and minor dependent, female, age 5 months." Murmurs rose from the crowd. A few women gasped. Most men said nothing. Frances staggered forward. "She is not property." Her voice cracked. "She is my child." 2 men in tan dusters stepped from the crowd, grabbing her arms. "She's mine. Please, please, she's all I have left." "Restrain her," snapped the bailiff. "She's not a debt. She's not a thing," Frances screamed, writhing as the men held her back. "You can't take her. Please don't take her." The auctioneer, unfazed, raised his gavel. "Opening bid, $100. A few hands went up. Old ranchers, gold-greedy newcomers, one woman in furs with a sharp jaw and cold eyes. Then came the voice that froze Frances's heart. $150. All heads turned. There, leaning against the post with a smirk that never reached his eyes, stood Gideon Kane, the richest man in Whitlock, owner of 3 mines, 2 saloons, and more than a few lives. "She'll be well taken care of," Kane said casually, lighting a cigar. "Better than with a beggar's widow." Frances screamed so loud her voice broke. "You son of a, she's not yours." The gavel fell. "Sold," the auctioneer declared, "to Mr. Kane, for $150. Frances collapsed to her knees. Kane stepped forward, slowly, savoring the moment. He reached for the cradle, and then they heard it. The sound of a single horse's hooves, steady, deliberate, striking the ground like war drums. A silence fell across the square. Out from the heat shimmer, riding into town from the East Trail, came a man dressed in cracked leather and draped in shadows. His coat was patched with fur. His beard was overgrown. His horse was gray as ash, and twice as mean. He said nothing. He dismounted, reached into his saddlebag, and dropped a worn pouch of gold dust onto the wooden steps. No one moved. No one dared speak. Frances looked up, her breath caught in her throat. 10 years ago, on a mountain trail covered in snow, she had dragged that man from the brink of death. He had no name then, just blood on his face and a hole in his leg. She had saved him. And now, without a word, he had returned, not to repay a debt, but to stop one. 10 years earlier, winter of 1869. Snow blanketed the world in silence, broken only by the wheeze of wind through the pines and the crunch of small boots along the mountain path. Frances was just 16. Her fingers were raw and red, gripping the handles of a sled carrying chopped wood and rabbit skins. She had run from a house filled with shouting and fists, seeking solitude in the frozen edge of the Rockies. And that was when she found him. He lay half buried in snow, his body twisted awkwardly beside a shattered tree trunk, blood staining the white in slow, thick pools. A man, pale from cold, unconscious, with a hole in his leg the size of her palm and bruises that screamed of violence. She dropped everything. "Sir," she whispered, kneeling, heart racing. He did not respond. Frances didn't think. She just acted. She pulled him by his arms, grunting through pain, dragging him foot by foot to her shelter. a crude cabin made from scavenged timber, hidden beneath the ridge. It took her half the day. For 3 days, she nursed him. She boiled pine needles and stripped cloth to clean the wound. He burned with fever, muttering in nightmares, speaking no names. She forced broth down his throat, held his hand during the fits, and watched over him through nights colder than death. On the 4th morning, she awoke to an empty cot. No note, no sound, just her front door, left open to the wind, and his boot prints, leading back toward the wild. She never knew his name. Noon. Back to present. Frances stood trembling, the sun glaring down on the marketplace square. Her daughter was still in the cradle, silent, unaware of the chaos. Kane stared at the pouch of gold dust dropped before him. "What is this?" the bailiff asked. The man in leather didn't speak. He only nodded once toward the child, then crossed his arms. The auctioneer hesitated. "Do you wish to challenge the sale?" He pulled out another pouch from his coat, heavier, darker with soot, dropped it beside the first. Coins clinked inside. Kane's face darkened. "You got no authority here, stranger." "I got gold," the man said, voice deep and slow. "That buys most things in this town, does it not?" Frances's knees buckled as the bailiff hesitated. "Double the offer," the auctioneer muttered, surprised. "Twice what Mr. Kane bid." The gavel hovered. Gideon Kane lunged forward. "You will not take what's mine." The man in leather stepped once toward him, hand brushing the side of his coat. Kane stopped cold. The gavel dropped. "Sold. 2. The mountain man." Whispers rippled through the crowd. Frances stumbled toward the cradle. The dust burned her eyes, but she did not care. She scooped her daughter into her arms, clutched her tight against her chest, sobbing. "Thank you," she whispered, without looking at the man. He didn't answer. But as she looked up through blurred vision, she finally saw his eyes. And in that moment, her breath caught. Those were the same eyes from the mountains. The same shadow that had once bled in her cabin. The man she had saved had come back to save her. Only now, the entire town stared at them, and the law wasn't finished. "I want her arrested," Kane shouted. "She ain't got papers. That baby's still a debt." Frances clutched her daughter tighter, backing away. The mountain man stepped between them. "She's with me now," he said. "And who the hell are you?" He looked Kane dead in the eye. "Isaac Crow." The name rang through the square like a distant gunshot. No one moved, but everyone remembered. That name, once a soldier, once a ghost, now back from the mountain, with gold, with silence, and with purpose. Under cover of moonless sky, Isaac loaded the last sack onto his horse without a word. He adjusted the saddle with one hand, then turned to Frances, who clutched her daughter tightly against her chest. She stood in the alley behind the saloon, her breath clouding in the cold night air. "Get on," he said quietly, nodding toward the horse. Frances hesitated. "Why are you doing this?" Isaac didn't answer. He hoisted her up behind him, then mounted in one fluid motion. Within seconds, they were galloping through the sleeping outskirts of town, hooves muffled by thick dust and pine needles. He had planned this escape long before today. They rode hard under a blanket of stars, the child wrapped in a thick shawl between them. Frances leaned into Isaac's back, feeling the steady rise and fall of his breath, the tension in his muscles. He didn't speak. He didn't look back, but every movement was purposeful, measured like a man used to surviving in the dark. She stole glances at him through the flickering moonlight. He was not the man she had known 10 years ago, not the dying stranger she once dragged through a snowstorm. This man was more scar than flesh, forged in fire and solitude. Frances shivered, not from the cold, but from memory. She had loved her husband, Gerald, or thought she had. In the beginning, he was sweet, full of ideas. But the mines had changed him, made him desperate, reckless. And when he died in that tunnel collapse, he left behind nothing but unpaid debts and a daughter too small to understand. Isaac was different. He said nothing, but acted with the kind of care that spoke louder than any vow. They reached the first ridge before dawn. The path narrowed, threading through dense pines, then opened to a canyon's edge. Francis gasped. Below them, 100 feet down, ran a frozen creek, sharp rocks lining the banks. Before them stretched a narrow rope and plank bridge, swaying gently in the wind. It looked ancient. Isaac dismounted, helped Francis down, and then took the child in his arms. "Cross one at a time," he said. "Stay low." She nodded, legs trembling, and stepped onto the bridge. Every creak of wood sounded like a gunshot in the stillness. She gripped the ropes, heart pounding, eyes locked on the other side. Halfway across, she looked back. Isaac was scanning the ridge. Then they heard it, distant, growing louder. Hooves. Francis's stomach dropped. "They found us." Isaac turned to her. "Move." She ran the last stretch, nearly collapsing onto the ground. Isaac crossed next, moving quickly despite the weight of the child and his pack. As soon as he reached her, he handed her the baby and pulled a hunting knife from his belt. "They'll be here in minutes," he said. She looked at him, confused. "What are you doing?" But he was already cutting at the bridge's anchoring ropes, his arms strained, face lit by rising fire in his eyes. "No," she whispered. "What if we need it again? If they cross, none of us will need anything again." The first torchlight appeared on the ridge behind them. Shouts followed. Isaac raised the knife for the final cut. The bridge snapped from one side, wood planks groaning as they tore loose and spiraled into the dark canyon below. The torchlight stopped. So did the shouting. Across the gorge, men cursed. One fired a rifle into the air, but it was useless. They were cut off. Francis stared down into the ravine, then back at Isaac. His chest rose and fell in silence. The night was still again, only the child's soft breathing broke it. She looked at him fully for the first time. "You knew they'd come." He nodded. "You knew the bridge would hold just long enough." He nodded again. She wanted to ask more, but she didn't. She simply stepped closer and whispered, "Thank you." Isaac looked away. They walked into the trees together, shadows among shadows. Behind them, the broken bridge swung like a severed lifeline, cut clean by a man who had already lost too much. The cabin was nestled beneath the rocky overhang, like a secret whispered into the land. Snow drifted softly around them, muffling every step as Isaac led the horse into the shed beside the choy. Francis followed closely, her daughter wrapped snug in a wool shawl, asleep in her arms. Inside, the warmth struck her like memory. The scent of pine resin and old smoke curled in the air, and her eyes adjusted to a dim but welcoming space. A single room made of thick-hewn logs, lined with old hides and shelves of dried herbs. The fire in the stone hearth crackled low. She looked around and blinked. There was a cherrywood cradle beside the hearth, carved by hand, polished smooth by time and tenderness. A faded rug lay beneath it, the kind woven by native hands, Shoshone, maybe Navajo, its pattern worn but proud. A ceramic jug sat on the windowsill, filled with sprigs of dried lavender and sage. Nothing in this place spoke of wilderness. It whispered care. Francis felt her breath hitch. Isaac said nothing. He took her coat gently and hung it by the door, then moved to stoke the fire. He poured hot water into a basin and gestured for her to sit. "Hands," he said quietly. She offered them, raw and cracked from the journey. He took them in his own calloused hands and pressed a salve, thick, pine-scented, into her skin. His touch was firm, but careful, and she felt heat rise to her cheeks despite the cold. "You didn't have to," she began. "I did," he said. "Nothing more." He brought out a pot of thin soup, wild roots, and dried venison, and placed it before her. When the child stirred, he showed her how to wrap a hot stone in cloth and tuck it beneath the bedding. Then, with quiet instruction, he placed a layer of warm ash and moss beneath the cradle to insulate against the floor. That night, Frances tried to sleep on the cot near the window, but the howling wind clawed at her dreams. She bolted upright, heart pounding, gasping from a nightmare too blurred to name. The room glowed dimly. She turned. Isaac sat by the fire, his shadow flickering across the walls. He was wrapped in a fur coat, crouched beside the cradle, adjusting a second layer of hide over the sleeping child. His eyes were distant. "I used to dream like that," he said softly. "The first few nights after I lost her." Frances said nothing. The only sound was the fire cracking. He returned to his seat and did not look at her. The next day, she found her dress had been mended, tiny stitches at the hem, where the fabric had torn. A wooden mug appeared by her cot each morning, filled with tea. And once, when she reached for a log and dropped it on her foot, Isaac appeared silently, lifted it, and placed it on the fire without a word. There was no warmth in his voice, but there was warmth in his acts. Still, Frances could not name what he was to her. Not yet, not trust, not comfort, but not fear either. Only a hollow space between them, filled with unspoken things. One evening, she was searching for a clean cloth for the baby and opened a cedar chest at the foot of his bed. Inside were folded pelts, a torn military coat, and beneath them, a bundle of yellowed papers and drawings. She lifted the top one. It was a sketch, rough, done in charcoal on parchment, a child's face, a girl with wild curls and bright, intelligent eyes. The features so tenderly rendered, so painfully familiar. Her own daughter could have been the model. Her fingers trembled. Behind her, the door creaked. Frances turned sharply. Isaac stood there, frozen in place, his eyes locked on the drawing in her hand, and in a flash, he strode across the room. He snatched the picture from her grasp, not violently, but with urgency. "Where did you find this?" His voice was sharp, shaking. I was looking for cloth. I didn't mean to." He turned away from her. His shoulders were rigid. "I said not to touch my things. I didn't know." For a moment, he did not speak. Then, without another word, he moved to the door, grabbed his fur coat, and stepped outside into the swirling snow. Frances watched the door swing shut behind him, and she realized two things. The girl in the picture was not just a memory, and Isaac Crow had never stopped looking for her. Frances had not slept. She had watched the fire die down to embers, listened to the wind scream outside, and held her child close through the night. Her thoughts churned, images of the sketch, the anguish in Isaac's face, the silence that fell like a wall between them. When the sky began to pale with the first hint of morning, she wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped outside. She found him at the edge of the cliff behind the cabin, sitting on a fallen log, overlooking the vast, white-stained valley below. His coat was dusted with snow. In his hands, he held a small knife, old, worn, the blade catching what little light filtered through the clouds. Frances approached slowly, her boots crunching softly in the snow. He did not turn, but she knew he had heard her. She sat beside him in silence for a while. Then, carefully, she reached into her pocket and pulled out the drawing she had found. She laid it gently across his knee. "I'm sorry," she said, "but if you want me to trust you, I need to know the truth." His fingers closed around the paper, knuckles white. The silence that followed was long, hollowed out by pain. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough, like rocks scraping the bottom of a dry well. "Her name was Ahsoka," he said. "Shoshone. Strong, smarter than I ever was. She saved my life during the war, and I married her before the ink was even dry on my discharge papers." He paused, eyes fixed on the horizon. "We built a life, not much of one, just a canvas tent and a patch of land near the river. But it was ours. Then Naya came along. Curly hair, fierce spirit. She was only 2 when the soldiers came. Frances didn't breathe. They accused her tribe of harboring Confederates, called her a spy's wife, said our child wasn't fit to be raised in savage hands." His jaw tightened. I was away, doing odd jobs down south. Came back to ash and bones. They burned the camp, took Naya. I tried to find her, but they were waiting. Broke my leg, left me to die. Francis whispered, "But you didn't." Isaac nodded once. "No, but something in me did. I spent a year dragging myself across the land on a splint. By the time I got back on my feet, she was gone. No name, no records, just gone." He looked down at the knife. "All I had left was this. Ahsoka gave it to me on the day Naya was born." Francis wiped at her eyes, unable to stop the tears now. "I'm so sorry." He turned his head, studied her face for a long moment. "You asked why I helped you that day in the market." She nodded. He exhaled. "Because I saw you fighting for her, the same way I couldn't fight for mine." She reached out slowly, hesitant. Her hand found his. He didn't pull away. "I'll go with you," she said softly, "to find her." Isaac blinked. "You've got your own baby to protect." Francis looked back toward the cabin. "Exactly. If they did this to you, they'll do it again. To others. To her." She turned back to him, voice steady now. "I'm not just doing this for your daughter. I'm doing it for mine." For a moment, something shifted in his face, like ice melting beneath the surface. His shoulders, always stiff and braced, eased slightly. His grip on the knife loosened. He nodded. "Then we go together." Francis stood, brushing snow from her skirt. Isaac followed. As they walked back toward the cabin, the wind picked up, but it felt different now, like a call instead of a warning. This time, they did not walk apart. This time, they walked side by side. Francis stood in the doorway of the cabin as the wind howled against the mountain. Isaac was inside, wrapping their daughter in a shawl made of buffalo hide. The decision had already been made. There was no more waiting, no more wondering. The past was calling them back to Whitlock. They traveled as merchants. Francis wore a faded green bonnet, her hands smudged with soot and dye from a forged trade license Isaac had bargained for with an old contact. Isaac kept his head down beneath a wide hat, his hair tied back in a way that obscured his face. The baby, now safely tucked in the care of a Shoshone elder Isaac once called brother, was left behind with promises of safety and return. Whitlock looked no different than when they'd left it. Same crooked buildings, same courthouse looming like a vulture over the square. But now, every step they took felt like stepping onto broken glass. Their target was the Whitlock Children's Asylum, or so the sign read in peeling white paint, a squat brick building at the edge of town, where rumors whispered of native-born children being brought for salvation. Inside, they found rows of bunks, a sour smell of mold and lye, and a dozen children too quiet for their age. A girl swept the far end of the hall, head down, arms thin but sure in movement. She looked up once, and Francis's breath caught. Skin the color of sun-warmed earth, hair thick and curled around her temples, eyes like Isaac's. But it was the mark that sealed it. As the girl bent to lift a crate, her braid shifted, and Francis saw it behind her left ear, a crescent-shaped birthmark, faint but undeniable. Isaac froze. Francis stepped forward. "Excuse me," she said gently. The girl looked up, wary. "Yes, ma'am? What's your name?" "Lena. Do you remember where you came from?" The girl shrugged. "They say I was left on the steps when I was little. I don't remember much before this place." Francis nodded slowly. Her voice trembled. "Do you have anything from then? Anything you've kept?" Lena hesitated. "Maybe." Before she could say more, the door to the hallway banged open. "Hold it right there." Gideon Kane's voice was unmistakable. He stepped inside, flanked by two armed men. Isaac pushed Francis behind him, but it was too late. "That's him," Kane growled. "That's the bastard who stole from my mine and tried to kill my men." "Those are lies," Francis snapped. "You forged." "I said take him." The guards descended. Isaac fought hard, 2 punches thrown, 1 man knocked down, but the third cracked him in the ribs with a rifle butt. He fell to the floor, grunting in pain. "Get him to the jail," Kane ordered. "He hangs in 3 days." Frances reached out, but Kane blocked her. "Careful, widow. You've already played your last card." That night, Frances returned to the edge of town. She waited until dark, then slipped into the orphanage's back lot. Lena was there. Frances didn't waste time. She pulled out the sketch Isaac had drawn, the one she had found in his chest. She handed it to the girl. "That's you," Frances whispered. "That's the girl he's been searching for. That's Naya." Lena stared at the drawing. "But, how can you know?" "Because I've seen that mark behind your ear. Because your real name was taken from you. And because that man, the one they're going to hang, risked his life to save my daughter. Just like he tried to save you." Lena's hands shook. She said nothing, just took the drawing and ran. In her bunk that night, Lena dug through her small wooden chest. At the very bottom, under her oldest dress, was a tiny bundle wrapped in deer hide. She had never known why she kept it. Inside was a carved bone charm, the shape of a crescent moon, a symbol she'd always felt drawn to, though no one at the orphanage had ever explained it. She turned it over and over in her hand, and for the first time in her life, something inside her said, "Go back, find him, and bring the truth to light." The gallows had been rebuilt overnight, fresh rope, tighter knot, taller platform. Whitlock's Square was packed by sunrise. Townsfolk called in like cattle for a show they didn't know they'd regret watching. Isaac stood with hands bound, blood dried at the corner of his mouth, a bruise blossoming across his temple. 2 guards flanked him, rifles in hand. Gideon Kane watched from beneath the courthouse awning, lips curled in satisfaction, arms folded across his chest. Behind the crowd, Frances moved through the alleyways like a ghost, cloak drawn tight, heart hammering. Lena was already in place. They had spent the night gathering support. Whispers passed in taverns, homes, back alleys. People who had once lost their land to Kane's legal traps. Families whose children had vanished into state care. Minors driven to drink or death by debts that should never have existed. Lena had found one man who had once worked in the courthouse, an old clerk named Merritt, half-blind but still sharp. It was he who had handed Lena the original documents. "Your husband's signature," he had rasped, pointing with a shaking finger. "It's forged. I remember that day. Kane threatened to have me arrested if I said anything." Now, Frances held that paper in her hand like a weapon sharper than any gun. The crowd was restless as the hangman adjusted the noose. Kane stepped forward. "For crimes of sedition, destruction of property, and attempted murder, this man, Isaac Crow, is to be hanged until dead." Frances stepped forward from the crowd. "Stop!" Heads turned. She climbed the steps of the gallows, breath ragged, holding the paper aloft. "I have proof. This man isn't the criminal. Gideon Kane is." Kane's face darkened. "Remove her." But she didn't flinch. She faced the crowd and held the document high. "This is the original debt contract. My husband never signed it. This was a forgery, used to take our home, our child." Gasps spread like wildfire. Frances turned to face the crowd. "And mine is not the only family he's destroyed." "She's lying," Kane snapped. "A woman desperate to protect a criminal." "Then explain this," Lena's voice rang out. She stood on the balcony of the sheriff's office, rifle in her hands, eyes locked on the stage. Kane turned, startled. Lena shouted, "He took me when I was 2, stole me from my family, told me I was an orphan, but I found the truth. You made me forget who I was." "You little," Kane barked. He grabbed a revolver from one of his men and raised it toward Frances. Everything stopped. Then Lena pulled the trigger. The shot cracked through the square. Kane's man screamed, dropping his weapon as the bullet tore through his wrist. The revolver clattered to the wood. Chaos erupted. Isaac moved. He swung his bound arms up and drove his elbow into the guard's throat, then swept the second man's legs out from under him. The crowd began to shout. Some ran, others surged forward. Frances ducked, covering her daughter with her body. Isaac ripped the rope from his wrists, grabbed a dropped rifle, and stood tall. Cain tried to run, but the townspeople blocked his path. Miners, mothers, old men, and boys, those he had cheated, abandoned, stolen from, closed in. "Try him," someone yelled. "Hold him for trial. No more hiding." Cain was dragged down from the steps, screaming curses, struggling like a trapped dog. The noose he had built now swung behind him, empty. Frances looked to Isaac, who stood above her, blood dripping from his brow, rifle in hand. But his eyes were not on Cain. They were on her, on the child in her arms. Lena descended from the balcony, rifle still smoking, face pale but resolute. Justice had found its voice, and it had not come from the powerful, but from the forgotten. 1 month later, winter had softened its grip on the mountains. Snow no longer clawed at the door of the cabin. It melted into streams that whispered through the trees, feeding the soil, carving new paths between stone and root. The air was brisk but forgiving. From the clearing outside the cabin, birdsong returned like a long-lost promise. Isaac stood atop a wooden beam, hammer in hand, adjusting a new section of roof. Not patchwork this time, something built to last. Below him, Frances knelt near a clay oven nestled into the earth, gently pulling out her first loaf of bread. The crust browned perfectly. She smiled, brushing flour from her cheek. Near the tree line, Lina sat cross-legged beside the little girl, now strong enough to crawl across blankets and tug at wildflowers. The teen spoke softly in Shoshone, guiding the child's chubby fingers to place smooth stones in a spiral pattern. "It means protection," Lena explained. "Circles keep the bad spirits away." Frances watched them from a distance. Her daughter giggled, freely now, without fear, and Lena laughed too, her voice lighter than it had ever been in the orphanage. For the first time, Frances didn't see the girl who had been stolen. She saw someone becoming whole. Later that evening, as the sky burned orange behind the ridge, Isaac came down from the roof, dusting sawdust from his shoulders. Frances was gathering kindling. Their paths met near the cabin's porch. Neither spoke. He offered her a cup of warm tea. She took it, their fingers brushing for the briefest moment. Then she reached for his hand, and this time, didn't let go. "I never got to say thank you," she said. "You already did," he replied, eyes holding hers. "When you stayed." A long silence passed. The wind curled around them like breath. Frances leaned forward and pressed her lips to his. Gentle, certain, a kiss not born from desperation, but from understanding, from survival, from the long road that had brought them here. He kissed her back. When they pulled apart, neither smiled, but neither needed to. Their silence held everything. Inside the cabin, the fire crackled warmly. A framed photograph hung above the mantel, taken by a passing traveler weeks ago. It showed the four of them standing in front of the rebuilt cabin, Frances holding her daughter, Lena beside her, Isaac behind them, one hand resting on Frances's shoulder, the other on Lena's. In charcoal, someone had etched a single word beneath it: family. The little girl now called Frances Mama. And when Lena had first whispered, "Papa," to Isaac, it had taken him an hour to speak again. Above the hearth, Frances had carved something into the wood herself, late one night. A phrase she had once heard Isaac mumble in a dream. "There are children born into war, but raised in love, stronger than law." Because in the end, blood hadn't made them a family. Choice had. Thank you for riding with us through the dust, danger, and devotion of this tale. If this story of love lost and found in the wild has moved your heart, then don't let it end here. Hit that like button, drop a comment with your favorite moment, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more unforgettable romances from the untamed frontier. Because out here, where the law failed, love endured. Turn on notifications so you never miss the next tale, where bullets missed, but hearts didn't.